Hello, I am Martina Galvan Rubi, and now we talk about the three theories we have dealt with so far and their representatives, as well as how they can be applied in literature. What is structuralism? It is an intellectual movement that analyzes literature as a system of underlying structures. One of the key figures is Saussure, whose thinking stressed the way language is arbitrary, relational, and constitutive, and it gave the structuralist model of system, which is self contained, in which individuals' items relate to others, creating larger structures. Then another key figure is Claude Levi-Strauss, who applied structuralism to the interpretation of myth. He suggested that the individual tale, let's say the parole, could only be understood by considering its position in the whole cycle, which is the lang, and also by considering the similarities and the differences between the tale, this specific tale, and the others. He also identified binary oppositions such as human and animal. Then, last but not least, is Roland Barthes, who focused on the general field of modern culture. He looked at items which had never been subjected to intellectual analysis before, and he identified five different codes, which are the priority code, the hermeneutic code, the cultural code, the semicode, and the symbolic code. So, how can I apply this to literature? Well, I took into consideration the Heart of Darkness, and for example, as regards Saussure's theory, we can take or we can analyze words such as civilization and darkness, which gain meaning in contrast to their opposites. So, for example, civilization makes sense when we take into consideration the opposition to savagery. Then, as regards Roland Barthes, we can talk about the jungle and its connotations. And as regards Claude Levi-Strauss, we may analyze the binary oppositions that throughout the text there are a lot of examples, such as light and darkness or civilization and savagery. What is post-colonialism? It is a theory that criticizes how Western ideas and literature have dominated, very often excluding non-Western voices and thoughts. This theory has three key figures who are Edward Said, who introduced Orientalism, suggesting a distinction between the Occident and the Orient, which is 100% political, and he also showed how the West has often portrayed the East just to justify their domination. Another key figure is Spivak, and she argues that power is shaped through language, identity, and culture, also that the West imposes violence on the East, and that the post-colonial subjects are often named and positioned as others, which completely marginalize them. Then her two key concepts are the third word women, which expresses the desire of people in the first world for a manageable other without acknowledging this need, and then the subaltern, which refers to those people who are inferior and who have no class consciousness, and they are portrayed as people who cannot speak because once they are given a voice through this Western framework, they are no longer the same silenced subjects. And then we have Baba, whose main interest is in the experience of social marginality, and his two key concepts are mimicry and hybridity. Mimicry produces partial presence but not full identity, so he explores how the colonized subjects are forced to mimic the colonizers. But this mimicry is never complete because, as he said, the colonized are almost the same but not quite, and later they are almost the same but not white. And then hybridity refers to this mixing of cultures when the colonized people come into contact with the colonizers. So, how can this theory be applied to literature? First of all, we can identify the stereotypes of colonized people. For example, how Africa is portrayed as wild, as savage, as an uncivilized place just to justify the European conquest. Then we can also ask who is speaking, if the oppressed characters are given a voice or they are just objects of someone else's story. And also we may identify mimicry, whether the characters speak for themselves or whether they copy or imitate the colonizers. What is narratology? It is a study of narrative structures and of how narratives make meaning. It focuses on what the basic mechanisms and procedures are common in all the storytellings, and it makes a fundamental distinction between what the story is and what the plot is. One of the key figures in this theory is Aristotle. He identifies character and action and says that the character must be revealed through aspects of the plot, that is, the actions. He also identifies three key elements in a plot, which are the hamartia, the anagnorisis, and the peripeteia. Then another key figure is Vladimir Prop. He worked on Russian folktales, identifying recurrent structures and situations. After analyzing 100 tales, he came up with the fact that all of them share some items from a repertoire of 31 functions, which seem to group into 7 spheres. And he also changed the concept of the character into rows of spheres of actions. And then Gerard Chenet focused on how the story is told let's say, in the process of telling the story itself. And he also discussed 6 particular areas in literature, which are whether the narrative mode is mimetic or diegetic. He also discussed the concept of focalization, which can be external or internal, the narrator, who can be covert, overt, heterodiegetic, or homodiegetic, how the time is handled in the story, whether it's analeptic or proleptic, the frame narratives and the embedded narratives, as well as the speech and the thought representation throughout the story. So, how can we apply this theory to literature? Well, for example, as regards Aristotle, we can analyze the 3 essential elements, which I mentioned before. As regards Vladimir Prop, it's quite complicated in Heart of Darkness because it's not a tale, but we can trace, for example, Marlowe as the hero of the story, of the novel, sorry. And as regards to Rationette, well, we can talk a lot, but we can say about the narrative mode that it is diegetic, all right? It's told by a narrator. The focalization is internal because we can see the events through Marlowe's perspective. We can also say about the time that it is analepsis, as we can perceive some flashbacks. And at the very beginning, there is a frame narrative structure, which is a story within a story. So all of these 3 theories are quite important in order to analyze not only Heart of Darkness, but all the pieces of literature that we read.